Finance Minister Tito Mboweni had a major challenge going into this budget, and one was uncertain what he could do to try and come out of the budgetary process on top. The country has been facing a massive increase in its budget deficits and a rising trend of public debt to GDP on account of three main reasons. Firstly, economic growth has been underperforming relative to what one would have hoped, and as a result, tax revenues have been undershooting. Secondly, state-owned enterprises have seen a marked deterioration in their financial and operational positions, and therefore that has put onus on government to bail them out with taxpayers' money, increasing government expenditure. And thirdly, over the past decade, partly as a result of misdirected economic policies and state corruption, one has seen a huge escalation in the public sector wage bill, way beyond what has been happening in the private sector. So in order to try and prevent this from deteriorating further, Mboweni had to address one or two or three of these reasons. Amazingly, on the tax front, he didn't raise taxes the way people had anticipated. That put the onus on having to do something else. He didn't restructure state-owned enterprises, therefore the big focus is on cutting back on the public sector wage bill. And the key to this budget's success will be the extent to which the government is able to stand up to opposition from trade union movements against these fairly draconian cutbacks on the rates of increase in public sector wages. Having said that, in the context of the constraints that the government faces, I think he did a fairly good job. There were many aspects other than those that I've mentioned that in the budget that were fairly encouraging, including the commitment to fighting corruption and allocating some funds towards that, the commitment to trying to boost small business activity by increasing small business incentives, and more generally actually trying to create an environment of macroeconomic stability. Little was said about certain factors that upset economic policy certainty, such as land reform, the National Health Insurance Scheme, nationalization of the Reserve Bank, and others. But I suppose one has to wait for the politicians to sort those factors out. In general, the country is still facing a massive challenge in controlling the rising trend of public debt to GDP, but hopefully at least this was a step in the right direction. As to what will happen to the construction sector, there was an encouraging commitment to shift the focus of government spending away from consumption expenditure towards capital investment, and the state president himself has made some encouraging noises in terms of trying to improve service delivery of infrastructural investment projects. But we have to wait to see whether those actually materialize. In the interim, the construction sector, we can acknowledge, has been much more adversely affected virtually than any other sector of the economy by the downturn in recent years and the dearth of infrastructural investment, especially by the public sector. The private sector has been doing its bit. There's been an increase in investment by the private sector, but there's been a dramatic reduction in investment by the public sector. And this has to be reversed if the fortunes of the construction sector are to improve at all over coming years. Building plans passed are showing a sharp downward trend, which augurs very ill for the building industry in the coming year. So we have to rely very much on the construction sector, the civil engineering sector, to be given a stimulus by government improving on the delivery of infrastructural investment projects. Whether it can do so remains to be seen, but one is encouraged by the calls for increased cooperation and collaboration between the government and the private sector in this regard.